Good morning and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Nat Malkus, resident scholar in education policy here at AEI. Welcome to our event today. What will the 2018 midterm elections mean for education? I'd like to welcome all those watching on live stream. Today we do have a hashtag for today's event so you can participate, and if you use the hashtag 2018 education, that's 2018 education. We'll take questions from the audience later on. We have a simple program. We have an hour to discuss the implications of last night's election for American education, and we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A here with the audience. Before I introduce our really excellent panel who will discuss the implications, I'd like to give a quick overview of the results that came in just about 12 hours ago, for those of you who haven't quite got to get up to speed on some of these things. So let's start with the congressional races. Now, coming into Election Day, the Democrats were expected to take the House of Representatives, and the Republicans were generally expected to keep control of the Senate, and that's how it played out. There are 80 races in the House. The Democrats slipped at least 26, and we'll sort of figure out how many more in the final count. Some of those were unexpected. The Republicans managed to flip 2 seats, and what that means is that we're in for 2 years of divided government. That means the Democrats in the House have subpoena power that gives them teeth and everything from national security to education regulation at the department. In the Senate, the Republicans flipped at least 3 seats, and it looks like their net gain should put them at about 53 seats. So they'll keep the Senate and almost have enough to maintain a majority all the way through 2022. The big questions are, what do these federal changes mean for education, and what the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos at the Department of Education might be able to do. But really, it's the down ballot races are where the education action is. And this year, dominated by teacher strikes, education funding battles, and sort of a surge in teacher activism, leaves a lot of room for discussion in the down ballot. So let's talk some governors. In Florida, Ron DeSantis defeated narrowly Andrew Gillum. Andrew Gillum was pushing for more education spending in Florida by legalizing marijuana, but it looks like DeSantis took him out. In Kansas, where ed spending was a very serious issue following a state Supreme Court ruling mandating that the state raise its spending, Republican Chris Kobach, who was sort of expected to win and promised to fight that ruling, he was defeated by Democrat Laura Kelly, who was willing to comply. In New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham defeated Republican Steve Pierce. Now, both of these candidates wanted to take apart the state education accountability system. It just happened that Grisham wanted to take more of it apart. She also took the seat. In Arizona, Doug Ducey fended off education professor from ASU, David Garcia. Ed funding here was another big issue. Again, in a state where Arizona teachers went on strike for a week and were given a 20% raise. In Oklahoma, another state with a strike that was settled by raises, Kevin Stitt defeated Drew Edmondson. Again, he was ready to push back on those tax hikes for those raises. The teachers' unions had sort of 2 governor candidates, vying for public enemy number 1 spot, and both were defeated. Scott Walker fell to Tony Evans, the Democratic state superintendent of education, and this after a good 10 years ago, Walker pushed through Act 10. And then Bruce Rauner, who's also vying for that top spot, was easily defeated by J.B. Pritzker. Rauner was the governor behind the Janus decision that the Supreme Court dealt a serious blow to the unions this year. In Colorado and Minnesota, Democratic governors prevailed over Republicans who were somewhat leaning into school choice. There's a couple of state chiefs races that we don't hear about too much, but they're very interesting, and both are too close to call at this point. A $50 million state superintendent of education in California race between 2 Democrats. Marshall Tuck, who was a charter school leader, not necessarily a friend of the teachers' unions, and a more traditional candidate, Tony Thurmond, who had union backing. Tuck had a slight lead, but it's still close to call. And then in Arizona, a more traditionally red state, Kathy Hoffman, who's been backed by the union, was up against Republican Frank Riggs. And if Kathy Hoffman wins, she'll be the first statewide Democratic office holder in Arizona since 2008. That also is too close to call. Look to state legislatures. A lot of people hoping or expecting for a blue wave thought that would show up in the state legislatures. And there was movement for Democrats. In New York, Maine, and Colorado, the Senate houses flipped. The House flipped in Minnesota, and both chambers flipped for Democrats in New Hampshire. The only win for Republicans in a state house was in Alabama. Here's the main line from this. There's one state government where the houses have divided government, and that's Minnesota. One state government. That's a big deal. As far as referenda go, there are a couple where voters got to speak directly to education. In Arizona, voters resoundingly defeated a referendum on the state's legislation to expand its ESA, or school choice program. And in South Carolina, voters voted to continue to be able to vote for the state superintendent and not to have the governor appoint it. And in a number of states, from New Mexico to New Jersey, voters passed increased spending measures for K-12 and higher ed. Whew. In an election where education wasn't supposed to be a big deal, we got a lot to talk about. And we have a great panel to talk with us. So I'm going to introduce them from right to left, and we'll get right into the discussion. Lene Erickson, the Vice President for Social Politics and for Social Policy and Politics at Third Way. We also have Jason Delisle, my colleague here at AEI, who specializes in higher education issues. Allison Klein is with us. She's a federal education reporter at EdWeek. Rick Hess is the Director of Education Policy here at AEI. And Aaliyah Samuel is the Director of Education Division at the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices. I'd like to give our panel a welcome. All right. And jumping right in, I'm going to pick on Rick first here. Before we talk about what the election means for education, I'd like to ask, what did education mean going into this election? I mean, I've saw polls that said, only a handful of voters thought that education was the top issue. But in some of the down ballot races, it's certainly more significant. Rick, what do you make of education as a driving issue up and down the ballot?
Sure. Well, I mean, one, I would quarrel a bit with your framing. I think there was a bunch of popular coverage, generally by general assignment reporters, who suggested that education was somehow going to play a big role in this fall's elections. They were focused on the teacher strikes, on the fact that there's, some enthusiasm, particularly in the strike states, for more spending, and they turned this into a big national narrative, particularly talking about the number of teachers running for office. It turned out, though, the Gallup October numbers showed that education ranked just where it always does. Historically, going back to, say, 2004, typically 2 to 5% of voters say education is the most important issue. It usually ranks between like 9th and 14th. This year, 2% said education was the most important issue, and it ranked 12th. So education was just about where you would expect it to be, despite the big stuff. It played a role in a handful of states, obviously in Kansas and Arizona, a couple of others. But the simple narrative that there was support for spending falls apart. Got voted down in Colorado, a spending initiative in Oklahoma, which was in some sense kind of ground zero for a lot of the unrest, actually got voted down. So look, I think education was a bit player in a larger narrative. That shouldn't surprise. Education matters most when the parties are trying to play for the middle. It's how Democrats show that they're not just crazy tax and spenders. It's how Republicans show that they actually care about creating opportunity. And this was not an election about running to the center. This was an election about energizing the base. And there's just much better tools in the Trump era for energizing the base than talking about K-12 policy, or higher ed policy.
I'll invite anybody on the panel to jump in and counter Rick. Or I'll move on. Allison, I'll start with you on this one. I'm wondering, moving forward over the next 2 years, as a result of this election, and I'm going to whip through everybody on this question, so prep your answer. What's the top education headline that results from this education that people shouldn't overlook?
In terms of the results, I mean, I guess subpoenas, right? I'm just expecting that I'll be spending my next 2 years watching Trump administration officials and Secretary DeVos, raising their right hand and swearing under oath. The Democrats can't wait to have these folks up on Capitol Hill and look into, the possible revocation of discipline guidance, the postponing of, and this is all very wonky stuff, but the postponing of special education guidance dealing with disparities. The transgender guidance that they revoked from the Obama administration, affirmative action guidance, the department's new system for looking at civil rights investigations. Instead of looking systemically, they're kind of going on a case-by-case basis. So, I think the next 2 years are really going to be dominated in the House by oversight and subpoenas. And if you all thought that maybe there was a chance that Betsy DeVos would get her big voucher program, like that wasn't going to happen before this election, and it's really not going to happen now.
I'll jump in on that. We do a lot of public opinion research, and I will tell you that most people don't know the name of any cabinet official. People know the name of Betsy DeVos. And Democrats used her in ads. That's pretty much unprecedented. Like, when's the last time that you used a Secretary of Education in an ad to rile your base up? It's been a while. So she managed to, really capture the attention of the left during her hearings. And I think that, DeVos under attack is what we're going to see. A lot of words like embattled department are going to be coming out in, over the next 2 years.
Yeah.
So I'll jump in. I just want to give a caveat. My role at NGA is to support governors on education issues ranging from early childhood into higher ed. We really are state-focused. We provide resources, information, any type of policy support, and we are a nonpartisan, bipartisan organization, and so we really fundamentally try to stay as be seen as content experts. And so with that, one of the things our team has been doing is really being mindful of watching how the education discussion plays out. And yes, it absolutely is part of packaged into a bigger discussion around workforce and the economy. But when you start to unpack that, there's really 4 key issues that we found. And one is certainly around workforce readiness, which includes CTE programs, STEM, computer science. Also, the K-12 funding issue, that's going to continue to be a discussion for us as we support governors, looking at does it go up, does it go down, how do we think about it, understanding the context of state budgets and those flatlining. Also, early education. We saw early ed come up as a priority amongst a lot of the candidates, now governor-elects. And not just pre-K, but also child care. Looking at kindergarten, many states don't have state-funded whole-day kindergarten. So what are the implications for that, particularly from a funding perspective? But then also higher education, recognizing that we have a lot of graduates who are not ready for the workforce, but yet they have a lot of student debt. And so those are just 4 of the topics that we know we'll need to be prepared to support the new class of governors on, and trends that we'll be watching very closely.
Jason, Rick, can you round us out with any headlines you think we should pay attention to?
Well,
Jake, go ahead.
yeah, sure. So, something more sort of broad, not exactly education related, but just sort of reflecting on the fact that the House has flipped again. Because I was always taught in political science classes that the House of Representatives, it'd be very difficult for it to change hands because of gerrymandering and unchallenged incumbents and all of this. And during my career in Washington, the House of Representatives has flipped 3 times. And so I'm just sort of thinking, wow, that's a big deal, right? This can happen. But with respect to the education policy, I think one of the headlines here is I think we're going to get to see. Well, first of all, the Republicans, somebody made the point earlier, they weren't getting much done on education policy amongst themselves. Particularly in higher education, you saw the committee barely pass a higher education reauthorization bill. But couldn't get the time on the House floor to get a full vote for that reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. I don't know if it's because they didn't have time or they didn't have the votes. But if you couldn't do it under those circumstances, obviously I think the Democrats will try to do their version now. Remains to be seen if they'll have the votes to do that. But I think one of the interesting things we're going to see is there are a lot of sort of ideas among the Democrats on higher education policy, at least, that have been percolating, but it haven't really gotten the sort of airtime because they haven't been in the majority. These are things like the free college plans and big changes to the student loan program. I think that we will get to see what those actually are now because they'll be given the attention.
And you know, two other headlines. One, I mean, I woke up I went to bed about 2 when I woke up this morning. I was like, I felt surprisingly good about the state of the country. I think the voters, they showed, you know, we wound up, however the heck we got here, in a place which I think checks a lot of the worst impulses of the last couple of years. They gave the Dems the House, which I think, you know, a divided government at this point in Washington seems like a really positive development. I thought some of the more sanctimonious and problematic Ds got pushed out of red states in the Senate, which seemed like a healthy development. At the gubernatorial level, it seemed like some of the most extreme candidates, Lene actually hit a great, I think. Some of the more extreme candidates, as far as the Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, wound up running way behind expectations, particularly in gubernatorial. And you saw folks like Kobach, who I don't think are particularly responsible Republicans, you know, got pumped in a place like Kansas. Seems like voters made a series of pretty responsible choices across the board. And I think the subtext for education of that is I also think voters showed, and policymakers showed a massive distaste for a lot of where school reform has brought us. Sophia Gallo, who works here with us at AI, and I wrote this spring about when you actually went and read the platforms that were out of the 250 or so folks running in the gubernatorial primaries. They were completely unwilling to talk about things that have been the building blocks of reform for the last 15 years. None of them wanted to talk, right or left, about testing or accountability or teacher evaluation or standards. What they wanted to talk about was all the stuff that hadn't been poisoned yet. CTE, because nobody knows what it means. SEL, because nobody knows what it means. Early childhood, because it seems nice and nobody screwed it up yet. Free college, because it seems nice and nobody screwed it up yet. And so I think what you've seen is this rotation away from a lot of the stuff that has become bitter and hostile and frustrating towards these other things. And I think folks in the education space would be well served by taking a really big, deep breath and reflecting on how they ought to be operating in this post-election environment.
Hey, Jason, let me pick up with you on HEA. HEA is sort of like the big federal legislation that's sort of been waiting in the wings. Now we have Democratic House. Is there any way forward for HEA, or do you think that we should just put a pin in it for a couple of years?
Yeah, well, I mean, so the Higher Education Act, so this is, you know, it's all the student aid programs like Pell Grants and student loans, and it has expired, so it's up for renewal. But of course, it just can keep going as well, right? So everybody keeps talking about, well, when are they going to renew it? And the issue is with renewing it is this is your opportunity to make changes, oftentimes smaller changes that wouldn't get the kind of attention and wouldn't ride along on a separate kind of bill. But like I said, that the Republicans couldn't do it on their own when they had control of both the House and the Senate. I think this makes it less likely. I don't know why. It's also been hard to see where the areas of common ground and agreement might be because there's been a lot of posturing. I think when you sort of know that the bill isn't going anywhere, what do? Well, you swing for the fences, right? And that's what I think the Democrats' version in the House looks like. I think the Republican version in the House looked to me like this sort of crazy Venn diagram of where Republicans are on higher ed policy. They want more government, some want less government, some want more spending and less spending, and the staff tries to fit something together, and it looks kind of strange, and at the end of the day, nobody's for it, right? But I think, I would imagine, Senator Alexander, who has been, who hasn't actually released a sort of big reauthorization bill, at least in this Congress. We might see him do that next Congress. And then we could see where they line up with the Democrats. But it doesn't seem like there's a lot of common ground there.
I have to disagree. I think that HEA is one of those things that could actually potentially get done in this scenario for a couple of reasons. First of all, Democrats like to do things. They like government, they like to do things, they like to have legislated so that they can say, hey, look what we did. And there's not a whole lot of areas where we're going to be able to do that. Like, I don't think we're doing comprehensive immigration reform with Trump in the White House. So what are we going to do? And this is one of the areas that, even as you say with Prosper, the ideological lines aren't as stark. There's actually a bunch of different different kinds of groups that have interests here, but it's not necessarily just the left and the right. And that's kind of a Rubik's Cube that you might be able to move around. And I know, Senator Alexander and Senator Murray have a very cordial relationship. They've been able to do things together in the past, really big things together in the past. And it's actually Senator Alexander's last time as chairman because he's going to be termed out. So he has a lot of, motivation to want to get something done. And in a certain way, having both parties have a seat of power gives them a better negotiating space than having, the House and the Senate just write whatever they want and then try to get like a couple of Democrats to jump on board in the Senate. That didn't seem to work, and I think if we actually start from a more bipartisan place, there might be a way forward on HEA.
So, Lene, let me just...
Well, let Elsa.
I was gonna pivot away from HEA, so go ahead and ask.
Okay, just to ask real quick and follow up on that. Let's say Jason's right and HEA doesn't pass now. Mm-hmm. What does this election mean for the Democratic higher ed platform going into 2020?
Yeah. Well, I really think that the message of the election, as Rick talked about, a little bit in terms of the Democratic Party politics, the message was mainstream candidates win races. And, there was a lot of folks that were saying what we should do is not try to win any swing voters, just get the base out because it's not possible to persuade people. And let's just find somebody who is as left as humanly possible, and they will magically find these voters that agree with them that will come out to the polls that have never voted before, and ta-da, we'll win. That did not work. It didn't work in Florida. It didn't work in Georgia. It didn't work in, super blue states where Republicans were reelected governor. And the people that were elected were people that were running on accessible, affordable health care, not single-payer health care. They were people that were running on kind of pocketbook issues. And so what I hope this does for Democratic politics on higher ed is kind of pivot in that direction rather than saying, let's make the biggest free college plan we can, and because what we need to do is, leapfrog each other to the left, the message is let's think through what would actually help families and help people to earn a good life and be equipped for the workforce. I don't know that will happen. That is my hope of the message that we take away from this election. But on the other hand, I have a spreadsheet of 35 people that are running for president that are going to announce in like the next 3 days. So they're all going to be looking for something where they can be the leftiest thing. And so I think there will be some people that are also trying to do that on higher ed. The tricky part on higher ed politics is that it's actually more about education level than it is about partisanship, right? It's like college-educated voters are concerned about their graduate debt, and that's like not really what most people are concerned about in the country. So if you're the person on stage with you when you're campaigning is somebody who has a $100,000 degree from their Georgetown master's program, that's not representative of most people's higher education problems. So
well, we should help them.
We should definitely. Jason really wants to help them. So he's very concerned. It keeps him up at night. But I do think watching Democrats go more towards college-educated voters will have an impact here too, because we've seen, that divide go even further in this election, where the suburbs, those college-educated places, are where Democrats got the pickups, and maybe they are going to, be more focused on things like 527 accounts and refinancing, and that would be a real shame because it's not actually the problem that most people have in higher ed.
I just wanted to say, we talked a lot about in higher education policy and also education policy, the sort of at the federal level, this sort of divide, right, where nothing's going to get done because there's this divide. But there is a place where the two branches of Congress have to strike an agreement, and that's each year on a budget deal, right, on an appropriations bill. So they have to do this, otherwise the government shuts down. And I actually think this is going to be an interesting place where I don't have any sort of prognostication on where the deals are going to be and but I think it's worth remembering that they're going to have to do that, and that's coming. Probably in the fall, next fall.
Yeah. Allison.
Oh, I was just going to say back onto areas where we could potentially, maybe, possibly see an actual bill and something getting done. One area to watch is infrastructure. Bobby Scott has a bill. It's about $100 billion in both grants and I believe tax credits for building schools in high poverty areas. Obviously, infrastructure is something President Trump has talked a lot about. He has not wanted to make schools and school renovations part of that picture. The Democrats do. Maybe, I mean, it's hard to imagine the Democrats wanting to hand Trump a legislative victory on anything, even if they control the House. But maybe we'll at least get a debate, right, about whether there should be an infrastructure bill that includes some money for school construction and renovations. That's one area to watch.
I'm sort of picturing that bill signing ceremony.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
Bobby Scott next to.
But
I mean, Bobby Scott he compromised on ESSA. He and his staff were a huge part of the reason that bill got done. So, I mean, they do like to do things. They have worked with Republicans in the past. And I think potentially if it was a less divisive Republican president, that's something we could see. It's hard with this political environment.
Allison, let me jump on that. So Virginia Fox was replaced by Bobby Scott. What does the House Ed Workforce Committee look like moving forward, especially as it relates to the department?
I mean, as I said before, we will expect to just see them call those folks up a lot. They may or may not be calling Secretary DeVos, although they always get great headlines whenever she testifies on the Hill. So I would expect she's testified, I think, we did an analysis a while back, less frequently than other education secretaries in her first year. I think that will change, so we'll see a lot of oversight hearings. And I would expect them to go on discipline first. The discipline guidance, because that actually hasn't been revoked yet, but we'll see where they decide to start. I mean, we're definitely going to see a lot of oversight, probably not a lot of legislating.
Rick, do you think that represents a lot of smoke and fury, or does that really change what the administration might be able to accomplish?
I mean, well, given that they've had 2 years of unified government and have accomplished nothing legislatively, I mean, it's hard to accomplish less than nothing. But certainly, I mean, to the extent that, as Allison has pointed out, that a lot of what they have tried to do has been in terms of guidance, either changing direction of Obama guidance, primarily changing the direction of Obama guidance. Look, that takes time, that takes energy, that takes staff focus. To the extent that they're getting subpoenaed, that they're getting called to testify, that they've got to prepare DeVos or other senior staff to go testify, given how poorly they have fared in some of these public appearances to date, sure, that's going to have a real impact, I think, on, and frankly, I think it'll have a bigger impact on a Republican department than it would on a Democratic department, because look, at a place like the Department of Education, Republicans feel like they're playing an away game. They feel like a lot of the career staff are professional, but not necessarily enthusiastic or supportive about helping them. When Democrats are at a place like Department of Ed, they feel like the career staff are much more just innately aligned with what they're trying to do. So given that, it means that the political appointees and the folks who are going to be involved in the subpoena and hearing process are going to be distracted from their ability to be involved in those other elements.
And I will say I recently reviewed Betsy DeVos's public schedule from her first year and a half. She met with many Republicans in the House of Representatives. I think she met with 10 times as many Republicans as she did Democrats, and now they're no longer in the majority, so that was kind of a lot of wasted time on her part. Also, before, I'd have to go back and 100% check this, but I believe before one of her appearances, I think it was to testify before the House, she had, it looked like 2 or 3 long kind of prep sessions before that hearing, and so I'm guessing that every time, I don't know how long Arnie Duncan or John King or Margaret Spelling spent prepping for these hearings, but I mean, that does seem to take up a lot of their time and energy that I would think that they would rather spend reorganizing the department, revoking other Obama guidance, or using the bully pulpit for school choice.
Sure. Well, I want to get to Aaliyah and ask about governors, but just to look at the map here, we have this was the state of the governorships. It says current, but yesterday, and there were just a few that didn't have races, and then you can see the states that flipped here: Nevada, New Mexico, Kansas. And so on. It's still a pretty red map, but 7 pickups. Aaliyah, if you're a governor, well, what did you learn last night?
So before I answer that question, I'll back up just a little bit. One of the things we also did is we watched very closely, particularly after the primaries, what were those topics within education that crossed party lines, so that regardless of party, it was an area of interest. And the top 6 that we saw was workforce, K-12 funding, higher ed affordability and accessibility, K-12 teachers and leaders, early education, and school choice. And of course, there's subcategories that funnel up into those. But across party, those are our major issues. And so if I'm a governor, which I'm not, in supporting governors, there's a couple of things that we would emphasize. One is education still very much matters across party lines. And there are some pieces to education where you can absolutely make traction on. And I think that bipartisan nature of sharing similarities or concerns across those education policy areas is a good place to begin the discussion. Also, that the messaging around education has changed. You're not going to be an education governor. Because of the vacancies that we see in the current job market, there has to be the connection between education, workforce, and the economy. And so we're seeing more and more governors that are workforce or economy governors, but when you unpack that, it's really an education discussion. And the other piece is expanding access, which lends itself to the equity discussion. We know that we're going to have to expand access to some of the workforce programs, the college programs, early education in order to fill some of these gaps. And so those are just a couple of the components that have to be a part of the discussion on the front end.
So, Rick, one race that I was paying attention to was in New Mexico because, ESSA was sort of set in stone, right? And now it's getting flipped upside down. I wonder how many of these races you think are going to really impact accountability systems or whether that's just old news.
I mean, honestly, you think about the state, we have taken the really long way back to 1994, which we thought of. Right, in 94, right, the Clinton administration's ESEA reauthorization proposal, right, was you test once in elementary, once in middle school, once in high school in reading and math. And of course, Clinton got savaged, especially by the teacher unions and the ed schools, for being a test-crazed maniac. And people said, what are you doing? And so they had to wind up putting that stuff in IASA, and nobody really did it, and thus we wound up with NCLB. Look, at that time, though, you had a handful of states, not a bunch, a handful of states that were really serious about test-based accountability. And where are we today? We've got a handful of states that are really serious about test-based accountability, and much of the rest that had kind of swept over the country has kind of gone back. And New Mexico, I think, was under Hannah and then under Christopher Ruskowski, one of the states that was really holding firm to kind of that Jeb Bush kind of, George Bush, Arnie Duncan playbook of test-based accountability, teacher evaluation. And it seems very likely that it will not be in that camp in 2 years' time. What do we make of that? Well, I think, again, look at it with next door Arizona. In Arizona, at the same time that we saw this kind of centrist bipartisan reform agenda go down, we also saw a pretty ambitious ESA proposal go down in the state that's probably seen as the biggest hotbed of school choice. And as you mentioned, it went down massively. Yeah. Even as a Republican governor was reelected while supporting expansion of ESAs, but also a lot more. Again, I think what's happened here is that the hard-edged definitions of school reform that many in this room have really grown used to, testing, accountability, teacher evaluation, unambiguously calling for school choice as a way to disrupt failing schools. I think we've seen over the last 3-4 years that those things have really increasingly lost purchase. And I think what we've seen is, what I hear Aaliyah talking about is on right and left, governors looking for another way to talk about addressing real practical problems in education. And I think New Mexico is one of the states that's kind of getting caught in that transition.
You know, Rick's brought up the power of teachers' unions a couple of times, and either directly or indirectly, and I just think it's really interesting that this is the first election we've had since the Janus decision, so you might have expected the teachers' unions to kind of lose across the board, right? We had all of these conversations about how that's the end of the teachers' unions. And in fact, they had a really kind of mixed night last night, I think. Mm-hmm. So, and that goes to your point that maybe we're not quite sure what ed reform means or what the politics are there at the moment, because like Scott Walker and Bruce Rauner were like enemies number 1 and 2, right? And they were taken out. They're gone.
Although the interesting thing on Rauner is he was also enemy number 1 on the right.
That's right.
That the pro-life community,
there
wasn't even a 2. There was only let's get Rauner out of there.
He had a lot of
an interesting
case. But when you look at who won within the Democratic Party, you know, Gina Raimondo was hugely opposed by the teachers' unions in every election she's had since she did pension reform. And Jared Polis is also really not beloved by the teachers' unions. And those are 2 of our, you know, our governors, one new and one who was seen as endangered and won her seat again. And then we've got Marshall Tuck kind of up in the air. So within the Democratic Party, there's, you know, by no means are the teachers' unions kind of taking over, but it also wasn't the case that they have no political power anymore because of Janus.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, and I know it might come up a little later in the discussion, but teacher activism is important to also remember. In the last 2 years, we have seen more teacher-led strikes that absolutely got the attention of their governors that will play a role. So as teachers regain their voice, and as a former teacher and principal, I can understand, and also a parent of a public school child, as more and more attention happens, particularly as the school safety discussion continues, K-12 funding continues, you're going to see more and more teachers elevating their voice, which will create those reverberations through to the governor's offices, because governors do for the most part, respect teachers. And so I think that's an important caveat to remember.
Well, I wanted to ask that next, and I'll put this out to the whole crew. There was a ton of activity this spring by teachers' unions. It was widespread and expected to have real traction. If you are the head of the AFT or the NEA, how do you make your case that, hey, here's the traction that we put out there, and what do you make of it?
I mean, I think the win by Tony Evers, and we talked about Bruce Rauner as there you go. The Kansas governor's race, I mean, that was not a state where we saw necessarily the same kind of activism we saw in Oklahoma, but, you know, obviously education funding did really well there. So those are 2 of, and then of course the Democrats took the House. Let's not forget that. So I think if you're the teachers' unions, you point to those kind of 3 big victories to say that they've done well. But I mean, in some of the states where we saw the most activism, like Oklahoma, I mean, the Democrats had a pretty strong gubernatorial candidate there. They had some hope there, and he was pretty easily defeated. So, and in Arizona, same deal. I mean, yes, Doug Ducey did end up making this deal with the teachers' unions that he would eventually raise their salaries, but he's also looking to cut taxes, so they're a little skeptical of whether that's actually going to happen. The state chiefs race there is like hanging on by a thread. So in some of these states where we saw kind of the biggest explosions of activism, we didn't necessarily see that translate to big results at the polls.
It was also a while ago, and I think like in our current environment, like 7 things probably happened while we've been talking about this. So I just like teacher strikes. When was that? That seems like eons ago in political time. And I think if it had been, you know, August or September of this year, that would have been a really different thing. But, you know, the half-life of political stories and attention at this point is so sped up in our current environment that you just can't expect something that happened a year ago to have any connection to what happens in the midterms.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was elected 2 years ago. It doesn't matter, right?
But that seems like a literal lifetime ago. So.
Rick, I'm curious about your take on the teachers' union's traction. Do you see it or do you not?
I think you certainly saw it in spots. I mean, I think, you know, like Alice pointed out, I think Kansas Regis Hester's was a huge surprise. The idea that Republicans can't hold the governor's mansion in Kansas, I mean, that's a big deal. The fact that, you know, Scott Walker had held on. I mean, the guy is the only governor, I believe, in history to survive a recall. The guy, you know, had won multiple races. He was Tough to beat the fact that State Superintendent of Instruction, who has been the longtime foe of kind of the signature Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, unseated him. That's significant. So I think there's real evidence that the teachers were out there. But I also think partly this stuff got overblown. There was this meme in the coverage about the record numbers of teachers running. It turns out, there's hardly any data on this, but the best there seems to be data. It seems that the numbers were more or less about flat since 2016, and nobody has any idea before that. There was a big fuss made on social media last night. A former teacher of the year won in Connecticut, right. First African-American woman elected to Congress from Connecticut. But the coverage was talking about how she's taking her pro-teacher agenda to Washington. I'm like, she's a freshman member of the House, people. You don't have an agenda you take. You're trying to find your office for 2 years. I mean, and a whole bunch of the darlings who are getting attention during the cycle. Bredesen was supposed to bring common sense, battle-tested Tennessee school reform to Washington. He was up 5 or 6 points 6 weeks ago. He wound up getting sandblasted despite Taylor Swift. Gillum was going to take away AR-15s and make Florida, a place where they were really putting huge new dollars into funding. He got unseated despite an RCP. I think he had a 7-point lead coming into last night. So look, I mean, again, I think like everybody up here said at various points, and like you framed originally, this was just an incredibly mixed night. Trying to distill, a macro narrative that either teachers came up empty is just wrong. But the idea that there was some kind of boomlet of teacher influence, either in state houses or in select races, I think is a big overstatement.
And I think the ballot initiatives are interesting too, because when you ask people on a poll, everyone loves education funding, right? Yes, education funding. You're going to get like 105% of people will say, let's have more education funding. But you ask in Colorado, do you want to raise taxes to have more education funding? And this is the second time in my memory in the last couple of years they've said, no, thank you. So I do think when you see the trade-off, you're like, well, yeah, I can generally run on education funding, but when I actually talk about paying for it like a governor would have to, it gets a lot more difficult.
Which is why DC is so interesting, like you were saying. I want to spend a ton more, and I want to cut taxes.
Yeah.
Oklahoma, there was enormous support. And remember, the governor, right? I mean, they came out, they got 16% for teachers, they did all this. But 18 months before the strike, the taxpayers had massively voted down a referendum to put more money in Oklahoma schools. And taxpayers, 6 months after the strike, just voted down a referendum to put more money. So I think, if you look at the EdNEC survey data, for instance, from August, for the 2018 poll, one of the things that gets missed in the narrative is Americans absolutely say they want to spend a lot more money on schools and on teacher salaries. But if you ask Americans how much the average teacher earns, they guess it's $42,000 a year. It's actually $59,000 a year. If you ask respondents how much they think we spend per pupil in schools, it's $8,000 a year. It's actually $12,000 to $13,000. When you tell them the actual amounts, it turns out that public support for increased spending on either schools or teacher salaries drops somewhere between 15 to 30 percentage points.
Although, if you're averaging DC paying $100,000 a year and,
right.
North Carolina paying like 20,
I think there's a big... They did this state by state, though. No, but they actually did this. It was an experimental design, and they actually did it. It was, what do you think they make in your state? And then here's what they make. But no, it's a valid point. And people still want to raise. You still get large numbers who want to pay more. So it's not that. But it's that the narrative that when it's divorced from you got to pay for this sounds very different from the narrative when it starts to become more fact-driven and particularistic.
Sure. So I was thinking about a comment, Rick, you made, and maybe Lene, you can kind of chime in on this about, this sort of this softening of the education sort of accountability agenda at the K-12 level, right? And interestingly, the higher ed, this stuff is just starting to heat up on the higher ed side. Right, just, sort of like behind it by like 15 years, right? But actually, if you look at the Democrats' higher education reauthorization plan, their free college plan has all sorts of accountability requirements for the states that they would have to abide by. And do you think that, but to my earlier point of like this stuff will start to get some airtime now? Will there be will people make the connection that they don't like this in K-12, they didn't like it in K-12, and they're now okay with it on higher ed? Or
I mean, there's pendulums all the time in politics, right? So it went too far on K-12, and then it kind of came back, and now we're in some middle gray space. As you said, on higher ed, we're nowhere, right? We just give out giant checks to institutions and say, "Hi, thanks for playing. Do you want another one next year?" So I think we're starting with nothing. So if we can move towards some level of accountability for any kind of results or providing any kind of outcomes to students, that would be a good thing. That actually isn't a super partisan thing, right? I think there's folks on both sides of the aisle who have said, wait a minute, maybe spending as much money as we do on higher education every year and asking for nothing in return is not a good idea. And how do we move towards that without overcorrecting and kind of doing NCLB for higher ed, which nobody wants to do. But a lot of the folks who are writing those accountability and thinking about those accountability proposals are the same people who did them in K-12, and so hopefully have learned from some of that overcorrection. And we just wrote a paper about that, actually, if you want to hear about the lessons of NCLB for higher ed accountability. But again, we're starting with literally nothing, so I think we can go a long way before we get to any kind of overreach in, where in K-12 we just were already asking a lot in return.
and there's another interesting development with the change in the chairmanship in the House committee along these lines is Chairwoman Virginia Foxx has been a really big outspoken critic and skeptic of more sort of federal involvement in collecting and disseminating information about student outcomes at colleges and universities. And that's actually, there's a sort of division there on the right. That doesn't exist, I think. I'm not sure that Lamar Alexander shares those views. And I know that the Democrats don't. So, I mean, that could actually be an interesting opportunity there.
I totally think that's right. The data conversation is one of those things that, we might see some progress on, especially, with, I think, Trump and DeVos have even been very vocal about their love of transparency, and whether or not they've actually done the things that they say they're going to do is a different question, but they've said that they really like it. I do think, though, to your point about getting more airtime, once it does get more airtime on the left, the idea of giving Betsy DeVos a bunch more data about students is going to cause some division on the left as well, especially with all the conversations about immigration. I think there are some people that are concerned about what happens if you have more data to this department in particular. I think there's a lot of ways to correct for that, but there will certainly be some folks on the left that are very skeptical.
So to turn back to state legislatures, again, if you look at the map here, you see just how red the map is. It's sort of alarming. And there were some states that didn't have elections, and we had some movement. The real striking thing is Minnesota. Again, I said this earlier. I just find this striking, is the only state house that is divided. Everybody else is unified. That doesn't mean that they have the trifecta with the government, but it seems to me that could be a case for, well, you should see more action in states with more unified houses. Of course, there may not have been a ton of action in the lead up with a pretty red map. And so I wonder, looking across the states, do we see any particular issues that might crop up with these new legislatures?
I actually, both Lene and I are from Minnesota, and we can attest that Minnesotans are very well equipped to manage divided government. They'll do it in a very nice way.
I mean, I would have expected, before the election, I wrote about states where ESSA plans could change depending on the outcome of the election. I mean, New Mexico, which you've already talked about, was sort of the poster child here. It was going to change either way. So we'll see. I mean, I'm guessing that they're going to kind of gut the teacher evaluation system, the A through F system, the PARCC tests, all of that there. But the other two states where I said, these are states to watch were Arizona, where it looks like probably the Republicans will keep the state chiefs, and certainly they've kept the governor's mansion. So probably no big changes there, even though the civil rights community is really concerned about how that plan treats English language learners. Florida was another state I said to watch, definitely no changes there. The civil rights community, very unhappy with that plan. I'm sure Bobby Scott will have possibly hearings on that plan, but I don't think that will actually change the plan for English language learners. And then California was my other kind of state to watch. I don't know how much power Marshall Tuck really has if he wins to change that plan, but they have this crazy or awesome, depending on your viewpoint, dashboard that's really difficult, some people would say, for parents to understand, or people on the other side of the issue would say that it is a good way to kind of look at all of the factors within a school. So I'm curious to see if those changes will come up. And then I would expect in some of these states, I'm wondering if school choice will end up, now since we still have these red legislatures, if there's still an opportunity for school choice, or if, as some people have argued, Betsy DeVos is kind of poisoning the waters on that. I'm actually curious what you think on that, Rick.
I mean, I think.
Sorry, I'm asking the question, but
No.
I mean, I think, right, it's the point you made about school choice is never going to happen in Washington, partly because to get it out of the Senate, you need a whole bunch of senators from places like Kansas and Nebraska who aren't actually all that excited about voting for school choice because it doesn't actually do very much for their constituents. And I think what happens is a lot of, when you look at where you've got red legislatures, they're disproportionately in these rural states. And when you think about how you go around as a Republican legislator, Republican governor in these red states, talking about pocketbook issues, addressing the stuff people are really worried about, it's how do people get jobs, it's about workforce and opportunity, it's about the stuff Lee was talking about. And sure, these are, you'll see some school choice push forward, I think. Certainly, they're not going to take stuff off the table, but there is this notion that it has become vaguely Washingtonish and charged in a way that it wasn't. And if you're a governor, you want to push things that are going to, and you're going to bother with education as opposed to some other things on your agenda, you probably want to do things that are going to play okay in the suburbs and with middle-class families. And what are those things? It's going to be CTE. It's going to be workforce readiness. It'll probably have something to do with college affordability and access. One of the reasons governors like early childhood is there's ways, both sides like it, is Republicans can do stuff in early childhood without necessarily feeling like they're putting money in bureaucracies or signing on to the agenda with the teacher unions. So I think you'll see a lot of that kind of stuff. And, school choice will probably draft in the back, and there will certainly be outfits like AFC that are out there looking at targets of opportunity. But I don't know. I mean, is Ducey, given the other stuff on his plate, is he going to really go into legislative session and make expanding ESAs a major priority after what they just saw in the referenda? I don't know. I'd be surprised. In Wisconsin, I mean, they're now going to be on the defense with Everett. So, I think, in Florida, is it really going to be kind of where DeSantis is likely to go? It seems like I'd be surprised.
So can I, on the early ed issue, I think early education continues to come up for a couple of reasons. It's not just an education issue, it's a workforce issue as well. And so I think for governors, it is a priority because you can address multiple issues. If families don't have access to high quality childcare, then they can't go to work. Or if they're going to work to only pay for childcare, that's yet another issue. And so there's multiple layers of early childhood that's important. And I think seeing it across parties, across states, across governor-elects really does prime the topic to become a real issue. I was pleasantly surprised. We have been doing a lot of work around with governors asking about, okay, we know early childhood's important. We understand the whole pre-K discussion, but help us unpack the birth to 3 space. What do we do there? And so our current class of governors have talked about it internally, but then we heard Governor-elect DeWine out of Ohio actually talk about birth to 3 services. So this is a Republican governor talking about early childhood. And so I think the fact that early childhood is a newer issue, although little kids have been around for centuries, we're all here. The fact that they can tie it to both workforce outcomes, education outcomes, and life outcomes, it's a real opportunity to move that policy area forward.
So I'm going to open it up in just a few minutes for questions. I want to ask the panel one last one. The primary season started a few hours ago for 2020. The results of this election does it change the landscape of education issues going into 2020 in any particular ways?
So one issue that I'm going to be watching, because I also have a spreadsheet of 35 candidates, is, and Rick brought this up, is testing. So we haven't really seen, actually I would say the opt-out movement kind of slowed down. They were angry about other things like Betsy DeVos and education spending and sort of stopped thinking about the tests. If you have 35 candidates though, they can't all just say career and technical education, pre-K, SEL, all the happy stuff. I feel like somebody's going to want to distinguish themselves by saying, okay, and now we cut back on tests. And whether or not they get the blowback from the civil rights community on that, I mean, they would within Washington. I don't know if they would, out beyond the Beltway where it really matters. So I'm curious to see who, if anyone, on that list of 35 ends up kind of running against, not just sort of status quo and accountability, but actually against accountability. We'll see.
Yeah, I suspect that someone will, because why wouldn't you make yourself, somebody's going to say, I'm going to take the teachers union platform and make that my thing because it's a way to distinguish myself within this giant field. I think there's a little bit of a different dynamic for the folks that are running from Washington versus other places. And if you look at the senators, a lot of the senators on that spreadsheet are already signed on to some version of free college because there's a bill and their activists can come and say, there's a bill, put your name on that bill. And they get that pressure. Now I'm hoping that they'll walk that back a little bit after the results that we've seen, but there's a reason to kind of call the question. Whereas you have people like Steve Bullock or Mitch Landrieu or Eric Garcetti that just are coming from a different place, so they're able to avoid some of the things they maybe don't want to talk about, and frame the education discussion in the way they want to talk about it. And how do we equip our workforce for the future? How do we make college accessible and affordable? How do we have actual paths to careers that aren't four-year degrees? And they have a little bit more freedom to play, I think. And most of the people on my spreadsheet are not from DC. So I think we're going to have a lot of new ideas coming in, new ways to frame it, and then you're going to have the senators kind of like fighting out for the senator lanes that they'll get in the debate.
Yeah, and I'll go back to what I said earlier. Is I don't think these free college plans have really gotten a lot of scrutiny. Right? People know what they are, and I thought they might die with the Clinton and Sanders campaigns from 2 years ago, but they haven't.
Sadly, no.
And I actually think that maybe one of the reasons why they haven't died is because they haven't really gotten any attention. And I think that they will once they do get some attention. And I think that's what we'll see over the next couple of years.
So I think the education issues going into 2020, people are still really concerned about not only the quality of K-12 schools, but also the safety of children and teachers. And I think as we see the teacher shortage gap, I just think that's going to continue to be a very real discussion. Also, the big emphasis on early education programs, especially if the new class takes off, talking about early ed as discussed on the campaign. Access and affordability for higher education is going to continue to be a big one. And then also the workforce readiness piece and its connection to education and the whole future of work discussion, which we didn't get a lot into here, but the future of work is definitely going to be a big one.
I think just at a macro level, look, as long as we're, in 2020, we're still going to be in this Trumpian kind of environment. And it's just going to be hard for an issue like education to get all that much traction. Because education, again, is always a way that folks try to, it's a way you appeal to NASCAR dads, to soccer moms. And right now, when, with kind of the bright polarized dynamics of the Trump era, there's just a lot of other stuff at work other than parties kind of catering. So I think, one, education is likely to kind of be lower down on the ballot than many of us in this room might like to see in 2020, like it was in 2018. The second thing is, I think Allison and Lene did a nice job talking about some of the dynamics on the left. I think on the right, look, I mean, if you're running in this Trumpian Republican Party right now, no matter how hard you're trying to talk about other themes, you're just going to get sucked up into this kind of macro narrative. If you're running for governor, you're running for Senate. And so, and that just doesn't leave a lot of room for talking about the niceties of education. So a lot of this is just going to be set dressing, I think, is the reality. And then to the extent that you are trying to talk about education issues, you look at this cycle. The initiative went down in Arizona. Doug Ducey won, talking about a lot more spending on schools. Scott Walker lost, despite having been battle tested and fighting, and being really an icon of choice. So if you look at it and you're saying, all right, well, what worked as far as Republicans talking about education? I think you come out of this and you say, you know what? I've got no clear direction. I can't look at anybody and said they won a major contest because they were out talking about ESAs or vouchers. And so I think what you're likely to see is folks in the gubernatorial and Senate contests on the right, you're probably to see a whole bunch of different tacks on education next time as people are trying to find out messages that resonate in different state environments.
Well, and I think even the committee is going to get sucked up into the culture war side of the Trumpian era that we live in. Allison talked about some of the regulations that they'll be going after first, but I mean, between Title IX and school discipline and school safety, i.e. guns, you can basically fit a hearing about every single culture war issue into ed and workforce, and I think that's what we're going to see because,
Great.
We can only hope.
Here we are. It's happening.
One a week.
So I want to move it to the
rename it
audience
in
for
January?
questions.
I would expect that they'll rename it, yeah.
I want to move it to the audience for questions. We got 2 mics around, and we have 2 rules for questions. 1, give your name and your affiliation, and 2, ask a question. Brendan.
Thank you. Eric Roblin from the Education Writers Association. It's a 2-pronged question, but the question is, do you see at the state level where this discussion sees a lot of opportunity here, is there a notable shift in the political dynamics at that level? Is there some kind of narrative across states on education policy priorities for the next year or two? And then the second kind of piggybacking on that is, can each of you identify a brand new governor who we should have on our radar on education?
So I would say there's no narrative, which is kind of what we've been saying. Obviously, there are kind of pockets of where education funding was successful, like in Kansas, which is actually my governor to watch, Laura Kelly in Kansas. Mostly because, oh my goodness, there's a Democrat in Kansas who ran on education funding in Kansas. And I'm curious to see, honestly, how there's been story after story about how kind of cash-starved those schools are. And I'm curious kind of, especially with a Republican legislature, how quickly she can change that and what it's going to look like. So no, I mean, do you guys see a meta-narrative other than the lack of a meta-narrative?
I mean, I think the temperature has been turned down on kind of the teacher wars, about accountability. As you've said, everybody's kind of trying to figure out how to not say anything about testing or accountability. So that could be good. They're trying to be in a gray area as opposed to kind of having an education reform fight and just picking one side or the other. But I'm very curious to see what happens in Colorado because Jared Polis is has been an education reformer to his core, and they've got some big decisions to make about how they go forward. So that would be my governor to watch.
So earlier I mentioned some of the overarching categories by candidates, and so those are really what I would say the trends are, which were workforce, K-12 funding, higher ed affordability and accessibility, K-12 teachers and leaders, early ed, and school choice. And I actually have 5 governors to watch. So definitely Polis out of Colorado, Gretchen Whitmer out of Michigan, Grisham, New Mexico, Pritzker, Illinois, and Devine out of Ohio. And for totally different reasons, from their discussion around teacher shortages to several of them shared the commonality of teacher shortages, also early education, debt-free college plans. And so because their priorities really aligned with some of those major trends, I'm curious to see how across those parties they're able to move from a campaign to an actual education agenda.
Clarify just I was really talking about the political shift of power. You had 7 new Democrats, 7 additional Democrats in governor seats, changes in legislatures. So to what extent are the political dynamics based on that power structure in states? Will that deliver some kind of meaningful movement in a particular direction?
I don't think so. I mean, I started this morning when we all saw each other in the green room saying last night was a Rorschach test and you can see whatever you want in it. So I don't think there is one kind of solid movement for and how it impacts education at the state level. I think there's a bunch of smaller movements, but nothing big happened there. And the things that were big that happened probably didn't happen because of education. Like Chris Kobach that happened because of immigration. That didn't happen because of education. So I just go back to Rick's point that education is not the most important issue on people's minds in elections right now, and it's not going to be.
As far as the Rorschach test, I think I love Aaliyah's list. What I would do is I would say, look, in terms of where the right's going, I'm really curious to see where DeSantis goes in Florida. You've got a Trumpian governor in Florida with the whole Jeb Bush legacy. And like I said, I'd be surprised if he comes out and tries to make a big play for school choice, but who knows? So one, how to interpret that Rorschach test would be fascinating. And then two, I think Evers. What does Evers actually go after? I mean, clearly he'll try to put more money into schools. He'll come out swinging for teacher pay. But is he going to try to zero out? Is he going to try to downsize Wisconsin choice programs? I think that'll say a lot about, how these dynamics, it's one thing how we have these debates in the Beltway, but I think how that plays out in Madison is going to be a pretty interesting snapshot.
Brendan.
Yes, good morning. John Bird with the National Society of Professional Surveyors, NSPS, who represent the surveyors, mappers, GIS folks, and geospatial professionals. Workforce development is the big issue for our members. Question, I guess, two would be ballot initiatives that would impact, hinder, enhance the federal flow down from the money to state houses, to legislatures, to the governor's agencies implementing CTE and workforce development. Number two, what would be the appetite for next Congress in doing a continued oversight over that entire process?
So on
go ahead.
just real quick on my end, we haven't even begun to dig that deep yet. I think most of us on our team are running on about 4 hours of sleep. So it'll be interesting to see, but we're not there. I'm not at the point where I would feel comfortable commenting on that just yet.
So when it comes to workforce development, this is actually one of the few, we talked about how Congress didn't do anything. They actually did something in this one area, which was pass the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. It didn't totally transform policy. It kind of took it from here to here, the bill, but it was a bipartisan achievement that everybody's very happy about. And it's not something that I would expect that Bobby Scott and his team are salivating to do oversight on when they have this long list of other things that they can't wait to dig into. So I would not expect to see a ton of oversight, at least in the House, on that. And I wouldn't really expect it on the Senate side either. I mean, I think Lene's point that Lamar Alexander, who's very passionate about higher ed, has 2 years to get this done. I don't know that he'll actually be able to do it, but I would expect that they'll take a good run at it. And so I don't think that, workforce issues are obviously part and parcel of that bill, but I don't think that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny of that issue. But I could be wrong.
Brendan.
Karina Karakulova, I am with BASIC. We are a coalition advocating for federal investment in our school facilities. So Allison, thank you very much for bringing up school facilities earlier. My question is, a lot of the discussion points that have been discussed earlier are somewhat toxic issues, whereas infrastructure is one of the few things that seem to be bipartisan. President Trump had said it's a priority. Vice President Pence has said a priority. Bobby Scott, as you mentioned, has said rebuilding our schools, his bill is a priority for him, especially as he will be chair in the next Congress. So I wanted to ask, what is your perspective on the state of our schools, the lead, the asbestos issues, which are not just urban or rural, it's urban and rural, it's an equity issue, it's a health issue. How do you see that debate playing in the next Congress and potentially in the lame duck even?
So when I'm trying to find a sad story about school infrastructure, as you mentioned, it's not hard to find. There's the South Carolina corridor of shame, people call it, just kind of crumbling schools in really poor areas. People agree on the idea of infrastructure just as a noun, that it's a good thing. but they don't necessarily see eye to eye on the idea that the federal government should have a big role in school construction. And I think the best example of that is back in 2009, and I'm really dating myself when I was covering
there was something about a stimulus bill.
Something about a stimulus
bill.
contentious? Yeah, well, that was the most, that you would think would be this like no-brainer. The Democrats like basically could like run the tables on that stimulus bill. They had control of the House, the White House. They had, almost a full, I believe it was a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and they still couldn't get infrastructure money. They couldn't get grants. They were able to get some loan forgiveness, but they couldn't get grants into that bill, and at like the best possible moment for them. So it's kind of hard to imagine that they will be able to get it now with divided government. But I'm always willing to be surprised, and I think it's something Bobby Scott will try to do.
But it also just costs money. And one of the things that surprised me in the poll that we did the day before the election was how deficit sensitive people have gotten again. And I think it's because Democrats have decided that they care about the deficit again because Republicans were in charge and passed a big tax bill that blew up the deficit. So suddenly people are talking about it again. And 86% in this election eve poll we did said that the deficit was very important to, to their vote and what they want to see people do in Congress. Now, whether people really actually care about the deficit or even knows what that means, I don't know, but let's just say there's not a lot of money laying around that's just extra that we're like, what do we do with this? So you have to trade something off. And I don't think that the parties are, in a place of being able to just do something and not pay for it.
So to pivot a little bit, currently at NGA, we have been working cross-divisionally to address school safety. And when I say cross-divisionally, working with our health, homeland security, and public safety and education divisions. And we actually released a request for applications to support states on the school safety issue. Within a 24-hour period, we had 19 states apply for 6 spaces. So it's school safety is a big issue. But one common thread to your infrastructure question that came through the request from the Homeland Security and Public Safety side of how do we look at the infrastructure of our schools from a safety perspective, but thinking about the entire facility. And so that doesn't address some of just the issues that we know, but it is coming up, the infrastructure as far as the building facility and safety through the school safety discussion. Where it will land with the new class of governors, I don't know. The federal level is not my lane, but I can tell you right now with our current class of governors, that has certainly come up, that as they're addressing the safety of the facility, and not just hardening schools, but overall the safety of their schools, infrastructure is coming up. It does lend itself to the money question, and there's not states that have come to a hard answer. There is no easy resolve, but I can tell you that the discussion is in fact happening, and I know it through our cross-divisional work we're doing around school safety.
I have time for one last quick question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Leah Cruzy. I run a PAC called Allies for Educational Equity. We're a peer-funded PAC across the country, funded more than 70 elections at the local and state levels this cycle. So in terms of through line, we're seeing stay the course. And in Colorado, we actually saw some 5 candidates for Senate we supported that did talk about school funding, did win their elections. My question is directed for the NGA. As governors are transitioning from campaigning to governing, a topic, so workforce development comes up, teacher shortage comes up, the not most thrilling but incredibly important to both of those areas topic of pension reform comes to mind. So I wonder, when you're thinking about content and support, do you anticipate some of these governors will actually be looking to address this looming issue?
And Aaliyah, you have 30 seconds to answer
No
that hot potato
fixed
question.
pension reform.
So actually one of the things, I have 2 of my team members here. Our team is actually meeting for a post-election meeting here because I couldn't get back to the office in time, so they're coming here. And what we're going to do is essentially a gap analysis of the current projects and support that we have to figure out, okay, now we know who our new class is, we know what they campaigned on, we know our current funded projects, what does this mean for the next chapter? And so between now and inauguration, our team will be preparing ourselves to support the new class, but then also we're having a convening with some partners It's a private event December 3rd to do just that, coalesce all the partners who we know either provide state-based technical assistance or support states, governor's offices, because we're not the only player. We certainly are an important one, but bringing them together to figure out, okay, how do we elevate because our job in part is a push-pull. We absolutely support governors and their vision, but they also ask us for guidance. So how do we elevate those items that we know are critical to the field? And also how do we leverage our partners and utilize that convening power and authority that NGA has? So our team is meeting from 11 to 3 here to start hashing it out. So I don't know how that's going to roll out. I will say it is a topic of discussion. But now it's looking at the incoming class, our current class, our projects, and what we're missing. So.
And in order to get Aaliyah to her meeting on time, we're going to have to close our panel today. Thank the panelists for their excellent contributions.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and we'll see you back here in 2 years.